Hey, get in, fellas. We're going back to therapy. Welcome to our second episode in this addiction block. We're going to start off with a bang. I've enjoyed having Mike and Richie on in recent episodes, and so we're going to plan on bringing them on more frequently to talk about the intersection of sports and mental health. This week, there was big news made in the sports world when the NFL adjusted its drug testing policy specifically around marijuana. We figured we're in the midst of talking about addiction, and we would talk about those changes and how it would impact the players. We're then going to transition to having a good buddy of mine, Michael Damioli, another Ohio boy, 303 rep Youngstown. And the next stage of change, we're going to move from pre-contemplation to contemplation, which means you're getting ready to think about a behavior change. You're knowing it's a problem. You're maybe not sure what to do with it, but you're getting ready to ask for help. We're going to end with a Bro Motions Hall of Fame inductee, Robert Downey Jr., where if you've had your head buried in the sand your entire life, he had a very serious substance problem that really riddled his whole life and career up until the early 2000s, way before he became Iron Man and became the superstar that he is now. Really struggled with those things. So we'll learn from him and what a great example he is of somebody who can make that change. And remember, if you're struggling with something, this is not about shaming. It's about learning how to grow and do better. All right, let's go. Welcome back, fellas. It is Wednesday, December 11th. We are in our second episode of the Addiction Block and coming up off of what I felt was a great time with the boys, all hanging out and talking feelings a few weeks ago. We've decided to bring the boys on whenever we want to talk about sports and mental health at the same time. Why is Red Zone from last Sunday going on behind me? That's because Mike's attention span is so short that if Red Zone was not on behind me, I could not keep him looking forward at the camera. Gentlemen, happy Sunday. How we doing?
Steelers are crushing the Browns right now, so I'm feeling pretty good.
Yeah, that's sad for like half our listener base. I think are Browns fans.
You know what though? They know where their season's at. This is all about just collecting draft picks.
That's true. I'm going to be watching the Bengals and Cowboys tomorrow night with two other sad Cowboys fans who all understand that none of this matters. Michael, because the Bengals have officially been eliminated, I've got the Josh Allen socks. That was a gift from Mike many years ago. Those Josh Allen socks have survived, I think, 3 places of living for me. So, yeah, shout out Mike. What's he going to get? I've gotten Mike some gifts over time. Oh, little Josh. I thought you were getting the wing socks I got you. The wing and celery socks.
Oh, the Funko. I love the Funko.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Funkos. I got a Stephon Diggs one too, though. So,
Mike, you know what a transitional object is?
We've had this conversation. I can't give you the full definition, but we've had the conversation. It'd be like the blankie.
The baby blankie, correct. The baby blankie that reminds you that you're safe even if your parents aren't around. So that Josh Allen serves as, that's Richie's transitional object.
John
reminds
Wick,
him of his parents. Yes, John Wick reminds him of his upbringing for certain that he's safe in this world with John Wick. So because we are a sports and pop culture podcast, Michael, your quarterback got engaged last week. How you feeling?
I know some people are a little upset. He's off the market. Overall, it's
you
a power couple. I don't want to talk about it.
It was a sad day on the internet when Joe Burrow got engaged. I remember because it wasn't like a celebrity. It's been his college girlfriend. And so everybody was like, what the fuck? And he's been dating her forever. So it's good. We wanted to highlight, if you've been paying attention or you pay attention to the intersection of pop culture and sports, it was very cute. Obviously, Haley Steinfeld is also super famous. And so their engagement was really A-list celebrity kind of news, where sports celebrity engagements aren't usually A-list news like that. Kelsey and Swift and a few others may do that. So we just wanted to include Josh being sweet here for a second before we get into what is truly our main topic today. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
While we're transitioning, I have no idea what Haley Steinfeld is famous for, other than she was in the Bad Blood video of Taylor Swift.
She's a singer.
Is she?
No, she's an actress. She doesn't love it.
Man.
She's more.
I'll tell you what, my girlfriend and her friends are all, she's an actress and singer.
But she's primarily an actress.
She's in the Pitch Perfect movies.
She's also Hawkeye. She's the whole Hawkeye series is her.
Oh, okay. I see her in the background of Pitch Perfect too.
Have you seen the Hawkeye? Have you watched the series?
I haven't. No, is it any good?
That's pretty good, yeah. And but she's like the main. She's Kate Bishop. She's the main.
So this is boys trying to learn pop culture here. It looks like her first was in True Grit. Was her first big movie.
Oh, that's
damn, that's
right.
a long time
I
ago.
did
She'd
know
have been
that.
super young for that. Yeah, she'd have been under 18 when she was in that. That movie was like 10 years ago.
At least.
Yeah.
I think that was when I was still
what's-
working up on the ranch. That must have been
so
like
it seems
12 years ago.
she became Fusic, Loved Myself. It seems like she's still releasing albums. I don't know if I know any of these
No,
songs.
she still releases songs, but her bigger claim to fame would be movies and TV shows, I would say. Then
Yeah, well, let's hear some E-News clip about Josh being a sweetheart.
Keep secrets from you. As for what he said in the moment the QB revealed, I said I couldn't wait any longer. I said I can't wait to start a family with you. I said your full name, and I asked you very nicely. As for Haley,
Look at that sweet boy. Sweet face, Wyoming hat. Gents, you can be maybe the best, the MVP this year, quarterback in the NFL, and be a kinder, gentler bro. Let's hold all those possibilities together.
Love it.
For our main topic today, we wanted to figure out some topics where we covered both the addiction block of the show and the addiction episodes and the intersection with sports. Not difficult, guys. In fact, we were planning on doing the steroid era of baseball for our first shot at this and ended up realizing that the NFL changed their drug testing policy this week, and specifically when it comes to cannabis, marijuana. And so we thought that'd be a cool thing to talk about. How is that different? How does it impact the athletes? What do we, as three guys who've been big sports fans our whole life, what have we noticed as far as drug test changes and things along those lines? So Richie was our big researcher for this topic. So Richie, talk about these recent changes to the NFL drug testing policy.
Okay, yeah. So the NFL, like Steven said, changed the drug testing policy this week. They had also previously changed the drug testing policy in 2020. So I'll go over that a little bit first. In 2020, the collective bargaining agreement came together and they decided that they will increase the amount of detectable THC in the drug test to go from 35 nanograms per milliliter up to 150 nanograms per liter. For reference, 35 nanograms per milliliter is generally lower than like a standard drug test that you'd take for your normal job, which is normally about 50 nanograms per milliliter. A nanogram is 0.0000000.
9.
Yeah, 1. Yeah,
9.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a point followed by 8 zeros and then a 1, and that's a nanogram. So yeah, so they changed it from 35 to 150 in 2020, and according to Black Cannabis Magazine, that 150 nanograms per milliliter is like detecting if like you had gotten high the previous week. This week, the NFL decided to up that even further from 150 nanograms per milliliter up to 350 nanograms per milliliter, which means that you probably smoked maybe a couple times the previous week or maybe even like a day or two before the test. So it's really allowing the use of cannabis to be a little bit more accepted in the NFL. The NFL also no longer tests for THC and marijuana in their April and August drug tests, which means that the players are free to use cannabis as much or as little as they would like in the offseason without any penalty of getting a fine or getting a suspension, anything like that.
So it's interesting, Richie. So basically they're saying if we're not going to test for this in the offseason and we're increasing our bar during the season, do you think the NFL is saying that this is not performance enhancing? Why test for it at all, guys? Like, what do they're not worried about in the offseason. It's not like you're doing steroids.
I mean, I think it's just kind of, the whole thing is kind of just, I don't know, I keep saying, but like ridiculous. I mean, it's nice that they're kind of pushing that direction, but just in general, again, it's not performance enhancing. Anyone who's ever done it would probably tell you you're not going to perform better on Sunday against other NFL players by taking it or practicing. So I don't know. I think a lot of these players are responsible enough to do it when it's not going to affect them, especially when you're talking millions of dollars on the line by doing these things. But that's just kind of my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, just going off of that, I think that the NFL is kind of just like seeing the writing on the wall. Recreational marijuana is legal in almost half the states now. So I think that they're just following along with that trend. I mean, essentially, the NFL is, they're a pretty old school league. They don't like to make radical changes or anything like that. It's just kind of the nature of the product. Whereas like the NBA, on the other hand, they're a little bit more radical. They'll do a little bit more changes. They stopped testing for THC, marijuana, completely in the last few seasons.
We can all thank our boy LeBron James for leading the player empowerment movement during the course of his career. The NBA, there was a lot of feuds in the 90s, right, Richie, around drug use in the NBA. Obviously, we had the big cocaine era in the 80s and how rough that was for Len Bias's passing. But over into the 90s, into the 2000s, the players really were putting up a fight over marijuana use. And I think it was smart of the NBA to just be like, fuck it. Why have that bad press if you don't need it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Kevin Durant, has been like a huge advocate of this. He's invested in like several marijuana THC companies. And he's been at the forefront of like getting this change. Man, I can't remember the name of the Netflix show with David Letterman. I think my guest needs no introduction or something like that. But when he went on there and was interviewed by David Letterman, and Letterman asked him, about smoking weed, and he had admitted to being high before he even came into the interview. He was high during that.
What's so interesting, Richie, like we were just talking about before, like who were the NFL players that have talked about smoking weed before games? Calvin Johnson, huge names, Marshawn Lynch, Ricky Williams, who's a huge advocate for marijuana. But like we all saw playmakers back on ESPN showing like steroid use in the locker room, but we know guys are drinking, during halftime and before games. I mean, it speaks to something you talked about, like we know it's not performance enhancing, but really I think what it shows is like everybody's brains are different, right? Whether these guys have built a tolerance to cannabis or whether, again, maybe some of these guys just have more trauma than us or people who've used substances in other ways. And so they need that to be kind of calm, and it may very well help them focus. Whereas for other people, they smoke weed and they can't focus on shit. So I think it just kind of shows the differences between people, but generally I just think it's an interesting trend.
Well, I'm one for, and to go along the same line, I want, as a fan, I want the best product on the field that you're going to get. And as long as it's not something that's performance enhancing, which again, I've said it how many times, it's not performance enhancing, and it allows them to, be their best selves without a competitive advantage, then I say, who cares? It's not detrimental to their health. I agree. I don't know. I'm just saying the same things over again.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about, like, we think about this a lot with public policy when it comes to incarcerations that have been related to cannabis now that it's legal in all these states. Like Josh Gordon, Richie, you were talking about that. Josh Gordon lost his whole NFL career to weed. And now it's basically like he wouldn't have gotten suspended probably, with the new rules. So
Browns might have a Super Bowl.
Yeah. Mark Davis Bryant. I'm a Steelers fan, lost 26.
Yeah. It's interesting to see this stuff change. I mean, it's truly stuff like this changes, like you said, Reggie, with the perception of the time. The NFL is certainly a more conservative league than the NBA. And so they're only going to be able to make these changes, I believe, when they feel like it's socially acceptable, much more than player driven. Because I think if this had been player driven, this would have gone by the wayside a long time ago, like it did with the NBA. The other part of this rule change was that they're increasing the fines for players, because what players love to do in the NFL was be like, I had my best game ever, and then I'm pissing in a cup the next day. And so they would really like players to crack down on that, even though, as we were just saying, the fine to do that still is $15,000. So my feeling is most of these guys are going to go ahead and post anyway if they feel like showing up the league.
Yeah, exactly. And also, like with marijuana usage, like a lot of guys say it helps with like their recovery, with their pain control. So it's not only like an anxiety, like any of that kind of thing, like actually with like their recovery from injuries. And a lot of people, it's a lot safer than using like a lot of opioids and those kinds of things. So instead of getting hooked on Oxy or something like that, they're able to get the same kind of relief from smoking weed or using a, CBD type scrub or whatever the issue is. So it's kind of like a safe alternative to those drugs that are like so commonplace in the NFL.
Yeah,
people get a big hit. Yeah, that are pushed. Someone gets a big hit, in the first half. They go in halftime and they get shot up with some kind of painkiller and are able to go out in the second half. And there's nothing wrong with that. And it's proven that weed isn't as addictive.
I saw Varsity Blues.
It's interesting, Richie, just as the doctor here officiating this conversation. So the shots they get are super high intensity anti-inflammatories. So it'd be like crunching up a bunch of ibuprofen and getting that like shot into a spot that's local and works. But the point still exists, which is after those immediate things, then they're given opiates like Vicodin. And we know how many players have developed pill problems over time based on that. Just pointing out that when you hear a player gets shot up and goes back in the game, that's not a controlled substance. the point still stands. I mean, there's all these guys over time have talked about, using marijuana instead of traditional pain medications that we know carry a host of risk and other things. And so it's just interesting. I mean, it goes to this point of like, we know that most people, and that's not true for everybody, but most of these high level athletes don't like develop a marijuana problem that causes them to like drop out of the league. But alcohol obviously leads to domestic violence. We've had guys get suspended, for amphetamine use. So like Joe Hayden got suspended for Adderall use during, early in the season. So it's just interesting that the perception's changing like that, along with the culture and along with the country. I don't know if this says anything about like mental health more broadly, other than maybe the NFL is accepting that this is a choice people can make to help themselves and not really police it on their behalf. So again, not saying that it's...
Well, I'm going to kind of go with what you kind of said before too about, players use these things for, mental health concerns, mental health issues, anxiety, things like that. So it is kind of pushing towards, hey, we understand that this is used beyond just, recreationally. So it is kind of a little more progressive for the NFL. I don't know if I'm going to call the NFL progressive yet, but just because
they don't want it. Never would be and never will be, which is I mean, the NFL is a product that really does truly try to cater to everybody in the country. And so they are known for just walking the lines, right? And they, my cause, my cleats, but also like can't kneel for the anthem. I mean, they try to do kind of everything. And I think it's tough. It's tough. I mean, they make the most money and they're king. So they're going to try and appeal to as much of the group as possible. I will say and end on this because we'll find other places to talk about marijuana use specifically during this addiction block, though you're going to hear a lot of alcohol and more harmful drugs as our baseline on the show when I interview with the other clinicians. But I will also say that if a Kevin Durant is smoking weed before he goes on an interview, if Ricky Williams is high sun up to sundown, it again speaks to the differences in brains. And those are the only kinds of people, when I get people in my clinic and they say they smoke weed after work or whatever to help them go to sleep, they'll have a gummy. I basically blow past it as long as they're living their lives, doing their jobs, good in their relationships. But when somebody tells me they wake up and hit their vape pen or they hit the bong first thing in the morning, it's when I start to wonder, what's going on here. And it's always a trade-off, right? What's the difference between smoking weed all day and using a traditional antidepressant? Great question. Everyone's got different brains. And like I would say, these guys in the NFL, they're all functioning pretty good. Some of my patients who come in and say, I smoke weed 24 hours a day and it's not a problem. Well, they're not getting out of the house and they don't have jobs. So a little different. So really functioning again. Before it kind of comes back to the whole thing. So, gents, this is great. In the addiction block with sports, we want to touch on the steroid era, which we're planning to do in the future, and just be thinking about topics. If you've got any other interesting topics, this was mostly cannabis and drug testing focused, then hit us up. We'd be happy to talk about it.
Go Bills.
Thanks, y'all.
I was just going to say, do we want to end this as we kick it to the interview with Let's Go Buffalo? So we'll be following up with our interview with Mike Damioli, and we're going to be talking about the contemplation stage of change. Mike, you want to take us out? Let's go Buffalo. If you are a Bills fan and you know that the song Shout is important, there were 6 shouts at Mike Slepian's wedding. So the biggest Bills fan ever.
We crushed the over. We crushed the over.
All right. See you guys after the break. Seashells. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining for our second episode in the addiction block. We are very lucky to have on a pal of mine out here in Colorado, Michael Damioli. He is a licensed clinical social worker as well as a certified sex addiction therapist. He grew up in Youngstown, Ohio. That's up in the corner of Northeast Ohio by Pittsburgh. As a result, though, he is a Cleveland sports fan, as most Youngstowners are, Browns, Cavs, and has zoned in a little more on Denver sports since coming out here. He started in Boulder, where he did his undergrad at CU. He'll tell us a bit of how his story took a turn and ended up finishing his undergrad in Arizona, down at Preston College. He has his master's, again, in clinical social work from the University of Denver. Also specializes in family therapy, sex addiction therapy, and why Mike is so great to have on today is that he is the owner and clinical director of Colorado Medical Assisted Recovery, which is a treatment center that integrates medical care along with mental health counseling and services. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Of course. Mike really was, when I started this process, he reached out and, obviously he has a lot to give given the world he's in and so many men who are seeking substance use treatment. So, Mike, as this is geared towards men in general, what do you think? Mike at his treatment center, guys, you've heard about these levels of care before. He has PHP, IOP, and outpatient levels of care. In substance, it's not much different than the world. We talked about this with general mental health conditions. Mike, what do you think as far as your male to female ratio? What are those just generally, do you think you have more of a male slant as we see with addiction numbers?
Yeah, I think probably 80% of our clients are male, 20% female.
You got any thoughts on why? That's a pretty heavy slant.
I don't know. I've heard the theories. I've heard the thoughts. I do think just generally addiction impacts men more often than women, but it's not 80-20%. I mean, it's I think socially women are less likely to seek treatment. I think they feel more bound to take care of responsibilities, take care of their families. I think men just generally socially, culturally have a little bit more freedom to seek treatment. I think there's probably maybe some bigger questions there about stigma and substance use and how that impacts men.
Yeah, I think too, maybe the men as the colloquially or kind of traditionally as the breadwinner, right? So if they have a substance use problem, they need to get their ass in treatment. Whereas if the woman is more in the home, I think we hear, right, especially with women in those roles, stay-at-home moms who are drinking martinis all day or having benzo addictions, to kind of cope with some of the doldrums of stay-at-home life. So I think there really, like you said, could be so many angles where you think of kind of the stereotypes around it.
For sure, and I think men were also enculturated to be less likely to ask for help. We're more likely to want to try to do things on our own. So I think getting men motivated to come to treatment, you have to ask for help, right? You have to ask for help a lot when you're through treatment, and that can be tough for men. We're not taught how to do that well.
We're not good talkers, and we're not really, that kind of it's a humble nature. Men get taught to be humble and kind of different in different ways, but again, more to a fault, right? So, but I would say that's probably cultural in general. But speaking of men seeking treatment, Mike, I would love for you to tell the audience your story, as it's such a cool story to lead you at where you are today.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. I kind of say I'm a child of the opiate epidemic. I really have a very quintessential story of opiate epidemic. I was exposed, I tried painkillers and stuff when I was in my teenage years, experimenting with drugs and alcohol. And I had this profoundly powerful experience the first time I took some opiates. And it's hard to describe besides using the terms it was a spiritual experience. It changed the way I saw the world. And I said, I didn't know I could feel that good. And I wanted to feel that way for the rest of my life if I could.
Yeah. It's interesting. People kind of think about that with psychedelics, but to know that can be an experience on really a lot of different substances, even behaviors that aren't substances. But yeah, you paint a picture, Mike. If you're in that in a situation where it feels that strongly, you're going to want to chase that down again.
Yeah. I've heard people say, the first experience is it's like getting a hug from God. And it's it sounds so extreme, but there's some truth to that. And, later in my career, as I've studied addiction and studied recovery, I learned that the clinical term for that is euphoric high responder. There's a genetic predisposition that my brain has more opiate receptors than the normal person, and I had a higher dopamine response than a typical person, and that started the process of rewiring the way my brain responds to drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, totally. We learned last week with Dr. White, kind of showing those spikes of dopamine. That's what Mike was talking about there, guys. You learned that last week, where maybe there is some predisposition for Mike, who gets a bigger hit of that dopamine that leads you down to be oh, I want that, versus some people who don't respond as strongly. It's all right, that was fine, whatever, and you can put the pill bottle away for the next decade. Just different types, different brains.
And some people even respond dysphorically to opiates. They get nauseous, they get hot sweats, they don't feel well, and they don't want to take them. When I took opiates, I could run a mile at a 5-minute pace or whatever. I just felt fantastic, and it energized me. We see it with the people who use alcohol too, right? Even non-alcoholics, just people respond differently. Some people get energy when they drink, and they can hang out at the bar all night talking and chatting. And other people have a couple drinks and they want to go to bed.
Yeah, I think in Colorado here too, Mike, cannabis is such an interesting thing. Some people get paranoid as fuck.
Yeah.
Other people, it chills them out. We see people walking around with their jobs here in Colorado, hitting their weed vape pens all day, and other people, they eat 2.5 milligrams of a gummy and they're out to lunch and asleep for the next 12 hours. And I truly just find that fascinating. I'm sure you see a ton of variation like that in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's a lot of things here that like I really try to approach addiction from a medical model, from a disease model. And it's not like the most intuitive thing, right? If you break your leg, it's like, oh, clearly you have a broken leg, diagnosed, treatment, it's all that's easy. We talk about addiction, we talk about mental health, things are a little less clear. But there's a lot of evidence here to support, addiction being a disease, and this genetic predisposition or our genetic response to drugs and alcohol is certainly one big part that plays into that.
For sure. Our hope here, Mike, being that people can kind of relate. We're going to talk a lot today about how to know if you've got a problem, also versus how to know if like a loved one has a problem. But the overall goal in the show being like the construct of addiction should not seem foreign to people, right? This is stuff that the vast majority of us are predisposed to because inevitably life brings negative experiences and inevitably humans don't like feeling those. So, that's the core. But how did you know, Mike, as a good example of things we'll talk about, like how did you know that it was time to seek treatment and how did that go?
Things got pretty bad for me pretty quickly. School started to fall apart. My friend group started to fall apart. And my days got very repetitive. My days got very dark. And my life got very small. It was just repetitive process of using substances and all that I could use and doing the behaviors that I needed to do to get those substances. And then, when they ran out, I would feel terrible and repeat that process. And it was pretty obvious. I think I lost something like 60 or 70 pounds in the last year of doing drugs. Yeah, I was not in denial about my substance use. It was very clear that I had an issue. But like seeking help is a whole different thing, right? Like, it's easier to wake up and use again than it is to say, I'm going to change everything about the way I live my life. So
Yeah.
you just, I delayed, I procrastinated, I put it off until luckily I have a loving and supportive family who saw what I was going through and came and had a conversation with me and had some boundaries around my behavior and offered to give me some help. And I wouldn't say I was excited about it, but I accepted the help and I was scared, especially those early days. Again, just going back to thinking about changing my whole life, even if I was miserable in what I was doing. Sometimes it's easier to stay miserable than it is to change how you live your life.
We see that all the time, Mike. I think that's an interesting kind of way to think about behavior. Substance is a behavior like anything, but people stay in abusive relationships. They stay in abusive jobs. I think you're right. Change is so hard and scary, whether it be kicking a substance or leaving a marriage. Like you have to be able to understand that it's going to be hard, like you said, and that eventually it'll be worth it because in the short term, it's going to hurt.
I don't know if you've ever heard of the paradox of therapy, but it's this idea that clients come to therapy seeking help, but not wanting to change. The paradox is they say, help me, but please don't make me change.
Right. Right. I do. I've joked about it on the show a bunch. Like I assign homework in therapy. People are like, what? And you're just like, well, you're paying to be here. Do you want to like get better or not? And I do think it's different by patient. I have a lot of motivated people, and a lot of people who just aren't. It's tough. It's tough, obviously. Well, speaking of, Mike, it sounds like your family put together like an intervention of sorts and really blessed that you had people with those, kind of with the resources to help you get set up and into treatment. So what did treatment look like for you from that place, that dark place?
Yeah, I was very lucky to have the family support. And my dad was a couple years sober at that point. He's many years sober now.
Good.
But I was lucky to have his insights and kind of understanding of everything at that time. Back in the day, right? I got sober, I think close to 15 years ago now, but it was a very different treatment industry 15 years ago. It was before the Affordable Care Act passed and before a lot of treatment centers opened up. So the model back then was very much extended long-term care. And I spent the better part of 8 or 9 months in a residential treatment center. But, I was 21, 22 years old. Part of it was learning recovery and sobriety, and part of it was growing up and becoming an adult, becoming a man, learning how to be responsible and not putting my life back together, but building a life for myself.
Yeah.
I really struggled with this desire of like, if I wanted to be sober or not. Like I knew I needed it. Like it was very clear, but I didn't know if I really wanted it. And it took a while for me to like build this kind of internal motivation for me to be able to see a life for myself without the use of substances, because from 15 to 21 all I had really experienced was substances. So I think what I needed was time for my brain to heal.
Yeah.
And it took me probably about 4 or 5 months until like I came out of this denial. And it just sounds so like funny to me these days to say it, but like the epiphany was, if I want to live the life I want to live, I don't think I could live that life and use substances of any kind.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, of course I need to do that. But when I was 21 years old, I mean, it was an epiphany, right?
Mike, I don't know, that's a tough thing to tease out. Like, just to give you some fictional and non-fictional examples, like we just featured a John Mulaney interview last week where he said, this is what's allowing me. It was what he felt was allowing him to live the life he wanted to live. And again, he came to the realization through treatment that he was living in spite of his substance use, not because of it, right? He was succeeding. Or like we featured House, MD last week, and he says that the pills help me function and they take away my pain, right? So it's really, I think it shows, and this is a great segue into our topic today, because we're going to talk about kind of like use, functional addiction, a use disorder, right? Where do all those lines exist? And obviously for Mike, he wasn't functioning like John Mulaney or like Greg House, right? So it's easier for him to be like, well, it's not like I'm a famous comedian or a TV star, So it's much easier in those scenarios. So Mike, we're having you on today because the world you live in, the kind of groups you run and stuff, we think you see a lot of patients that are in the contemplation stage. As a reminder, last week we learned about pre-contemplation with Dr. White, which was our chance to be like, this is the assumption that the people you're talking to have no interest in changing. So we focused on the stages of change themselves. We talked about some biology, kind of like the biology, psychology, and social angles of addiction in general. So Mike, talk about contemplation and maybe how it's different than pre-contemplation.
Yeah, you said it well, right? Pre-contemplation is this living in denial, right? Maybe there's a problem, maybe there's not, but it hasn't quite reached our prefrontal cortex where we recognize it's an issue. Contemplation is starting to recognize, yes, there are some issues here, but you haven't fully committed to changing those issues. Yeah, I think we talk about denial and coming out of denial. I think people think it's an event, right? You just wake up one day and all of a sudden denial's gone. But it's not. It's this process. It takes weeks and months of like understanding the disease, understanding yourself, understanding what's happening, giving your brain time to heal, that we start to like build that insight, build that understanding, and recognize, yeah, maybe I need to make some changes.
Yeah, and you make a good point there. We've talked a lot about, stages of grief as a pendulum swing back and forth. And addiction and the stages of change, very similar, where like you would love to think that recovery is a straight line or it's a circle, but really dimmer switch up and down, step forward, step backward, both practically and mentally.
Yeah, absolutely. And we could be in different stages about different behaviors. We could be in the action stage of change about our alcohol use, but still be pre-contemplative about marijuana or other addictions or other behaviors in our life. They don't always go together.
That's a good example, Mike. I'm sure you see this in your clinic all the time, where I'll have a lot of people who've like kicked every substance, but weed, but cannabis, but marijuana. I wonder just, what that says in terms of their functioning, but kind of the point of meeting people where they're at, Mike, which is helping them conquer what they're ready to conquer. And we'll get to the other stuff as it's needed.
That's all you can do.
Yeah. How do you know I want to know, Mike, this is perfect from you, right? You've experienced this not only as a patient, but also now as a practitioner.
Mm-hmm.
For me, that's, less substance and more depression, self-esteem issues, the stuff that I've had to work on, communication and those kinds of things. So we're really happy to have another person here who's lived in both worlds. So how would you, from both those perspectives, know when it's time to get help? How can our audience today, whether it be substances or other behaviors, work, gambling, sex, video games, all these are different things that we as men can be addicted to. How do you know when, in general, it's time to get help for a behavior like that?
I think it's different for a lot of people, but I think like a real safe bet is to ask the people around you that love you, that care about you, that know you. I talk about this like with business guys sometimes. It's like if you're own a business, if you're a CEO, like you don't want to make all those decisions for the business yourself, right? You want some sort of board of directors around you, some people that you can go to for guidance and advice and support. And think about that for your own life, right? Who would you want to be your board of directors? Maybe it's your parents, maybe it's your close friends, maybe it is people at work. But if you really are somebody who has the disease of addiction or is predisposed to it, like part of the disease is that you're not unable to rationally see your own addiction, right? There's a medical term for it. Maybe, I kind of forget. And it's not just in addiction, right? Like we see it in bipolar, we see it in a lot of other disorders where there's the denial of it, right? So like going to the people around you to say, hey, what do you think of my substance use? Do you see this impacting me? Do you see this impacting you, my loved ones, my family? Do you think this is an issue? Do you think this is something I need to take a look at? I think that's a safe place to start.
Simple, not easy, right, Mike? I mean, we're going to make a lot of this stuff today sound simple, and yet we already talked about how asking for help and asking for that kind of feedback, especially if you're in that contemplation stage, which means you are starting to understand this is a problem. So you're about to get, or you don't know, but you can expect that you're about to get some tough feedback, right? Especially from the people in your life who are honest and will tell you the truth.
And that's the scary part, right? Is once you start to get that feedback, then it's harder not to take action around it.
Yeah,
So
totally.
if there's some way you can separate that in your mind of, I don't need to make decisions about this yet. I'm just in the information gathering stage. Let me take an objective look at this.
We talked about like House and John Mulaney and other millions of examples of like functional substance use, right, Mike? Like these ideas, like, is that a phenomenon that's real? Like functional alcoholic versus having an alcohol use disorder, and how do you delineate them?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think there's a lot of people who struggle with the disease of addiction that haven't experienced the consequences where it like debilitates their lives. But does that mean it's less of an issue, Internal versus external motivation, right? It's like we need to be motivated to change. And sometimes like we think that like it's this, we put a lot of emphasis on this internal motivation. Like you need to change for yourself. You want to change for yourself. And that's great if you have that, but like for some reason we think that's better than this external motivation, which is I need to change for these other reasons, these other people, these other institutions in my life. We talk about like the functional alcoholic, right? We're saying, oh, they don't have like the external motivation to change. They haven't experienced these consequences. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of reasons that somebody would want to make changes in their life. So yeah, I think lots of people who struggle with the disease of addiction are able to maintain certain aspects of their life. And how much happier would they be if they were able to remove those substances? How much more productive would they be if they were able to remove those substances from their life?
Yeah. Totally. And Mike, you hit the main point that in order to what we used to call like alcoholism, now in the Big Purple Book is called alcohol use disorder. You have an internet use disorder, opiate use disorder. So that's a newish term in terms of how we quantify this stuff. And Mike hit the point that any psychiatric illness, you've heard me say this, requires impairment of social and occupational functioning. So the people who we, describe themselves as functional alcoholics, at minimum, they don't see how it is impairing their social functioning, their relationships, their friendships, their loved ones, their parenting, right? And their occupational functioning, how they're doing at work and as a student and other roles. So, just kind of noticing, like, if you've got someone in your life that doesn't see those things and doesn't see how those things are impacting them, then they're really probably not in the contemplation stage yet.
Right. Yeah. I think the functional alcoholic is usually based on whether or not they can maintain a job. And especially for men, right? I think a lot of the value society places on us, or the what we're enculturated to believe, is that our worth is based on our job title and our income. So if you can maintain a good job title and you can maintain a good income, then you probably don't have problems, which is the furthest from the truth, right? So
correct, right.
When they sit in my office, they sit in my chair and say, okay, great, work's going well. Let's talk about your home life. Let's talk about your relationships. Let's talk about your physical health. Let's talk about your dreams and your goals for life outside of the job, and are substances impacting those things.
Yeah, totally. And I think it is. It's just hard when people are using substances to defend against the exact feelings that we need to be experiencing to drive that insight. So I wonder, Mike, like some warning signs that either loved ones of people with problems here in our audience or the audience themselves. So what do you start seeing that moves from like quote unquote functional over into addiction or a use disorder, as we'd say? When does that line start to get crossed?
Like internally, I think we all have morals and values that we want to live up to. And when we start to compromise our personal morals and values due to our substances, I think that's such a big red flag. I would never drive drunk. And then all of a sudden you're driving drunk.
Yeah.
I would never lie to my wife and my kids or my partner and my family about my substances. And then you're lying and hiding it, right? That kind of stuff where it's, you no longer feel proud. You no longer feel like you could be honest and open about your use, about your drinking. That's definitely, such a big red flag. And for families, I think it's the same kind of thing. Are you seeing a change in somebody's behavior? Are you seeing a shift in their personality? Is this not the person that they were months or years ago? And the way they interact with the world, the way they interact with themselves, with the way they interact with their family and their support system. I think those are kind of the warning signs. The real technical stuff is like, especially for drinkers, like if you're drinking in the morning to get rid of a hangover, that's a huge red flag, right? That's where you're starting to build the physical dependency on alcohol or any substance, right? If the use never quite ends, that really is when you're starting to put yourself into a dangerous situation.
Yeah, Mike, you talking about an eye-opener made me think about the CAGE questionnaire. This is something for people can evaluate their own alcohol use, and then also loved ones can evaluate their alcohol use. So you want to talk about the CAGE questionnaire?
No, I'm not really as familiar with that.
Okay, so we screen people. Fun fact, how about that? So we screen people for alcohol use disorder by listing these questions. Are other people concerned about your drinking? Are people annoyed when you drink? So CA, G is, do you feel guilty about your drinking? And E is, do you require an eye opener? Hair of the dog, right? That's what Mike was saying, where your drinking never ends. People will recall that during COVID, we couldn't close down liquor stores because people, I wouldn't say they require alcohol around the clock, but that brings kind of the next thing that really hammers home use disorders and what's characteristic of an alcohol or a substance use disorder, although really any use disorder, right, are two concepts, tolerance and withdrawal.
Mm-hmm.
So when we were in that COVID pandemic, these people have developed such a tolerance to alcohol that they truly do need to continue using it, or else the withdrawal from alcohol can be deadly. So, and people really had a hard time wrapping their heads around that, Mike, especially for the people who, your mindset was, this isn't an addiction, it's just a mindset they need to overcome. And it's like, we didn't have the hospital beds to deal with all these people in the ICU withdrawing off alcohol.
Yeah. I remember that, the shortest prohibition in American history. It lasted 12 hours or something.
Right, it was crazy. I think they were like, everything's closed. And then the next day it was like, wait, except liquor stores. And I remember a lot of my friends and family were like, what the fuck? Understandably, because it made no sense unless you have that context of, right? So think about this, guys. Tolerance implies that you need more and more of a substance or a behavior to get the same effect. So Mike is in the sex addiction world, right? You have to keep upping the ante of the riskiness of your sex, the wildness, whatever it's fulfilling for you. But with alcohol and opiates and benzodiazepines like Xanax, these all have very characteristic withdrawals, which is like, if you stop using without weaning off of it, you're going to get tremor, you're going to get dizzy, lightheaded. And again, for alcohol and benzos can be seizures and death. So it was really, really important at the time. But definitely if you're evaluating this for yourself and you're like, man, I need to smoke more and more each night over years and my tolerance is built up, or alcohol, same concepts, that if you're noticing that you do need more to get the same rush, that's something that should be a warning sign for you.
Yeah, and I'll emphasize that again. If you're drinking and you stop drinking, if you're having physical withdrawal symptoms like shaking, sweating, you need to seek medical attention. It is dangerous. It can be life-threatening. Alcohol is the most dangerous substance to withdraw from. Heroin, you can withdraw all day. It's not life-threatening. It's miserable. You'll want to die. You'll feel like you're dying. You won't die. People die every day in our country from alcohol.
Yeah. Alcohol and benzos, which I imagine you in some ways bundle because they hit the same receptors and the withdrawal is very similar. So, different, right? Taking a pill versus the alcohol, there's a lot of different ramifications, but biologically they're very similar. Mike, I'm curious, in this world where you've had to live it and you have so many patients who are in just different various stages of change. Addicts are frustrating. People with use disorders are frustrating. What kind of mindset do you bring into work that allows not only you to stay sober, but like to work with some probably frustrating people?
I try to remind myself very often that what we're dealing with is a disease, and to look through the symptoms and to recognize that these aren't symptoms of somebody who's a jerk. These aren't symptoms of somebody who's a bad person. These are symptoms of somebody who is struggling with the disease. And when I try to maintain that mindset, it helps a lot. But it's not easy to do. When people exhibit the symptoms of the disease of addiction, they're very off-putting. Somebody can be aggressive, they can be mean, they can be resentful, they can be remorseful, there's lots of off-putting symptoms. So it's hard to see through that.
I hate the word manipulative, but it comes up in addiction all the time. They're lying to me, they're gaslighting me because I'm asking them about their use and they're saying it's not a problem. Clearly it is. I imagine most of us have been in a situation like that with a loved one or ourselves.
Yeah, and I think to go back and remind ourselves of why are these symptoms there? Yes, it's a disease, and somebody is scared. It's coming from this place of fear of change, or from fear of losing their substance, which means a lot to them, right? It has benefited them immensely in an earlier part of their life, and even though it's no longer benefiting them, they're still holding on to that idea that this is a positive thing in their life. So
yeah, absolutely.
I try to come from this perspective of believing, thinking that most of our clients or most people who are struggling with addiction want to change, that they have this inherent desire, that they don't want this, that they recognize to some degree that it's an issue, but that they don't know how to change, that they don't have the resources, they haven't been given the tools yet, or that they're, again, being crippled by the fear of changing. So coming from that perspective of people do want recovery, people do want to change.
How much DBT have you been trained in? Because it sounds a lot like the principles of DBT, right? This we understand people are doing the best they can with the skills they have. Yeah. We understand that people have to want to change and they have to do better. We're doing our best and we need to do better, right? All these constructs. And I'd imagine those kinds of principles are used in addiction treatment all the time.
For sure. I think there's, DBT was designed for borderline personality disorders, and there's a certain level of personality disorder that goes with addiction, right? It warps the way that you see the world.
Yeah, truly. And then, of course, connects into trauma and that core construct of addiction of take away a feeling you don't want, give yourself a feeling you do want. And, people who suffer pretty bad trauma, they got a lot of feelings they don't want. That's something that I would like everybody to walk away from this episode with is people don't do nothing for nothing, and usually if a person's getting sucked into an addiction that, we don't validate bad behavior and we could find reasons. I think most people, when they look more broadly at a person, that's why I want to have you, talking about how you keep a mindset that's healthy if you're dealing with somebody with addiction, because if you're not pissed at them actively for something they did, then you can probably take a step back and understand the source, what's the story and how did we get here?
Yeah. We talked about if you're somebody who might be struggling with substances, to go to your support system, go to your quote unquote, your board of directors and ask for that feedback. You definitely need that too if you're somebody who loves somebody with a substance use disorder, because you will start to see things through their eyes. You'll start to see things through their world, their manipulations or their frustrations, and all that will rub off on you. And you want to believe it because you love that person and you want them to be right and you want them to be telling you the truth. And you need somebody objective in your life, or people who are objective in your life, to help you see the world the way that it is.
Yeah. Mike, I'm interested because I came from the eating disorder world, which is an addiction like anything else, right? It's something to control. And, my world was tough because we did involuntary care with teenagers. And so the vast majority of the kids who came to our treatment center, they did not want the help. I will spare everybody the gory details. That it made it complicated. In your world in substance, I'd imagine people get dragged to rehab against their will all the time, or they, how much does a patient have to want to change in order for it to be successful? Because it made a big difference in the eating disorder world.
Yeah, I think if we recognize addiction being a disease, we recognize it changing somebody's thought patterns, their inability to see the world the way that it is. Building that external motivation at the start of treatment, helping them to establish some time of abstinence to allow their brain a period of time to heal where they can start to see the world correctly and start to make good decisions for themselves. It's imperative a lot of the time, especially if somebody has really gone down the rabbit hole and is deep in the world of addiction. Yeah, I think forcing is kind of a strong word, right? But yeah, you will, if you go to an AA meeting or if you spend any time in the recovery world, you will hear countless stories about how a judge helped me get sober, or about how my wife helped me get sober, or a family member, or my boss, or somebody who's able to put some leverage onto them to establish a period of sobriety where they can start to make better decisions for themselves, where they can start to advocate for themselves. And eventually, like you do need to make that decision for yourself. You do need to find reasons internally that you want to stay sober or you want to change your life. You absolutely need that. But
Yeah.
for a lot of us, it can just take time, and it could take more time than we expect.
Yeah, for sure. Because especially when I think about this, Mike, if you've been like using, like you said, you were using pretty consistently for 5-6 years as a youngster. It's going to take time, to really let that heal. It's not just Rome built in a day kind of stuff, right? There need not only biologically but psychologically as well, just kind of breaking those patterns and allowing some distance. Speaking of, you talked about going down the rabbit hole. Do you have a way to describe the inner world of somebody struggling with addiction that can help, what's the experience like, something along those lines, to help our people really understand what it's like when you're stuck in that world?
That's a good question. The way I think about it is I think of this word survival. Addiction becomes a mode of survival, right? So it's like, maybe you guys touched on this a bit on the last episode, but when I think about like dopamine and the disease of addiction, right? Dopamine is this chemical that tells us what feels good. And the reason something feels good is it's supposed to be good for survival, right? Like eating candy, eating chocolate cake, that stuff feels good because it has lots of calories and sugar. And you need to know if you're like dying of starvation, that chocolate cake will save your life. But eating broccoli and Brussels sprouts just doesn't have the calories and fat and sugar that you need to save your life, right? Drugs and alcohol also release lots of dopamine, and they trick your brain into saying this is good for survival. But your brain on that basal level doesn't know. And so over time, your brain says, what do I need to survive? And it'll start to categorize drugs and alcohol higher and higher on that list. That's why you start to put aside the other things in your life that aren't as important, right? Even as goes as far as spending time with family or loved ones or work or food or water, right? Because your brain is just saying, all I need to survive today is alcohol. All you need to survive today is cocaine, because that's how your brain has developed. So right, you say like, hey, it's time to get sober. You have to stop doing this thing that you need to survive. And that's terrifying on a level that the person doesn't even have conscious recognition of. But you're saying, right, you're trying to take away the main survival skill of this person. So I don't know, if you see somebody really struggling with addiction and they're exhibiting all these behaviors and they're stealing and they're lying and they're all these things, you say, well, this person is doing what they think they need to do right now to survive. And I'll tell you, as somebody who struggles with addiction, it feels that way. It feels like, especially in the early days of the idea of sobriety, it feels like death.
But Mike, interested to think, you're working with people in all the different stages of change. We got loved ones here. How can a loved one, what strategies can they use, and what ideas do you have for them if they're trying to help somebody get from that contemplation, maybe the change talk is starting, to help them move forward with, quitting alcohol, quitting cigarettes, any behavior like that, or any substance?
Yeah, I think somebody needs to feel like you're on their side, right? We used to like really approach addiction treatment in this very confrontational way. It was like, you got to beat the addict out of somebody. You got to like go to war with your addiction. We're all going to like team up and go to war with your addiction. And we've kind of like over the last few years or couple decades have learned to take a much like gentler approach to it. And there's a theory that we use called motivational interviewing. And it goes way back to like the humanistic psychology of the 60s and 70s. Carl Rogers was this guy who was like, it sounds kind of wild, but it's like, well, have you just tried asking mentally ill people what their problems are and talking to them about it?
No, that's crazy.
Yeah.
We were drilling holes in people's skulls and, calling them hysterical. when they were just women with trauma, It's crazy.
Early in our education as a therapist, we're taught there's all these theories, there's all these different ways to change, but what really makes a difference between somebody in a therapeutic relationship? And it's this trust you have with your therapist. It's this empathy that you feel like your therapist cares about you as a person. Maybe they don't always agree with your behaviors, but as a person, that they see you and they care about you. And that's the core of motivational interviewing. Find somebody that you trust, that you feel cares about you, or if you're providing that support to somebody, come alongside them, show them that you care, show them that you understand. And then what you can slowly do once you have that trust is start to develop some discrepancies, right? You say things like, on the one hand and on the other hand, right? So it's well, on the one hand, you tell me that you don't think your alcohol is that big of a deal, but on the other hand, you tell me that it's you and your wife are fighting most nights of the week, or you're saying you just got a DUI. Maybe there is a bit of an issue there.
Yeah. I like that you're laying down hey, we need to validate, we need to get this person, because inevitably if you try to come at somebody with, help me understand the difference between these two poles, people are going to put their guard up if you don't have the right rapport with them, or if you're pretty confrontational around it. So we have to spend a lot of time building that rapport with somebody, and hopefully with a loved one you have it. But then, you do move into those types of things, right? Of kind of trying to draw people's attention to the discrepancy.
Yeah. We call it evoking change talk. Just slowly starting to talk about what are some ways that we'd want to change. Asking how bad of a problem does this seem like it is to you? Why don't we rate that? On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad do you think your drinking is? It's a 5? Okay, great. What would it look like if it was a 6? What would it look like if your problem was a 7? And do you feel like you're there? How much do you want to change this? On a scale of 1 to 10, how motivated are you to change? You're a 6 right now. Cool. What would it take you to get to a 7? What would get you to get to a 10? What would you need to do? What would life need to look like for you to get to a 10?
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of those changes that we might be able to.
Yeah, there's an acronym that's easy to remember, though you don't really need to do this while you're with somebody in the moment, but it's OARS, OARS, where, the core of motivational interviewing has 4 skills. We ask open-ended questions. We do a lot of affirmations, which is validating. So it makes sense that you'd feel this way, or of course, this is hard to quit substances. We do a lot of reflective listening and summarizing. So to Mike's point, right, what I'm hearing you say is blank. Because we talked about this with parenting in DBT block, Michael, there's nothing that's going to get somebody to talk to you than you summarizing. Okay, what I'm hearing from you is that it's just too hard right now and you're too overwhelmed to quit. No, I didn't say that. Okay, then what did you say? And so you don't do that on purpose necessarily, but you're repeating back what you're hearing to, one, let them know that you're trying to hear and you're trying to listen, so they know that you just said, hey, what I'm hearing is, but if you hit the nail on the head validating, usually it gives a puff. If you miss the mark in validating, usually you get a bump up as well of just anger or whatever the emotion is.
For sure. Yep. And you're trying to validate who they are as a person, not necessarily the things that they do, right? Yeah. Things have been really tough for you lately. That's validation. It's not validating to say it's okay that you drank last night if it's not, right? Validating who they are, not necessarily what they're doing.
Right. Validate the emotion, not the behavior. I love that 1 to 10 stuff. I think I ask people, I use that all the time. And that's diet, exercise changes, those kinds of stuff. It just comes up in my clinical practice all the time, using simple tricks like that.
It sounds funny, but it's a real Jedi skill.
For sure. Therapist, Jedi, just kind of having a knowledge and control and things, and knowing where you can take a conversation. Mike, what if, and to wrap, I want to think, just because we're going to keep moving forward with these stages of change. And next week, we're going to talk on preparation, which is you taking the steps, making a plan, maybe looking up treatment centers, understanding what you need to do to move forward to prepare to, usually the answer is give up substances. But Mike, what if somebody is not ready to give up substances? What can you do to be supportive, or what do you think? What do you see?
It's such a big question, if it's somebody you love, I think you want to talk about this idea of helping versus enabling. What can you do to help this person, be there for them, but not make their substance use easier for them. And that's tough for us if we love somebody who's struggling with an addiction, because we don't want to see them struggle with the consequences of their use. And a lot of times that's what somebody needs to make the changes.
Yeah.
If somebody's struggling financially because of their use, it probably means don't give them money. If they're unable to go to work because they're too hungover, it means not calling their boss and lying for them. And this isn't easy to do. And again, going back to having your own support system or having your own board of directors, people that you can go to and say, hey, my loved one is asking me to do these things for them. I don't know what I should do. Can I have some objective feedback? That's really important.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. I think it's things that we're going to touch on as this block goes, including what's it like from the loved one's perspective. So there's great resources out there like Al-Anon, which is essentially AA for the loved ones of people struggling with alcohol use. And kind of we really are going to do an episode where we focus on if it's somebody in your life who's having that problem, and really focus on it from there. Mike, it's so great to have you. I am almost certain that you'll be back for another episode in this block, because we're planning to go through all these stages of change. And as much as Michael sees people in contemplation stage, he also sees them in the action and the maintenance stages. So the action of stopping the substance and getting treatment, the maintenance of staying away from your substance or behavior, reestablishing your life. So he has a lot to share. And we're really, really fortunate to have had you today.
I appreciate it. I can't wait to come back. And, I love it. I love people in recovery. It's tough to see people struggling with addiction, but when you see them make the changes, you see the lights come on. It is the most rewarding thing I get to experience in my life.
Yeah, absolutely, everybody. So speaking of people who have recovered from substances, we're going to slide over to the Bro Emotions Hall of Fame to talk about one of the most famous recovered celebrities out there, Robert Downey Jr. See you in a sec. All right, y'all, settle in for what is a fascinating BHoF with a man who needs no introduction, Robert Downey Jr. Born on April 4th, 1965 in Manhattan, his father, Robert Downey Sr., was a filmmaker and his mother was an actress. They met in the course of filming one of Robert Sr.'s films. No surprise, we know Robert was a childhood actor. He first appeared in one of his dad's films at age 5. His relationship with his father is what led to his complex relationship with substances and why we're focusing on him today in the addiction block. His quoted as his father having that of note, both of his parents struggled with drug and alcohol use as their monetary success fluctuated, along with Robert Sr.'s successes and failures in the film industry. What we know is that Robert Downey Jr.'s father first smoked weed with his son at age 6 and started doing cocaine at age 8. All right. So imagine the complex nature of having a father-son relationship that's based around drug use. Robert was quoted as saying, when my dad and I would do drugs together, it was like him trying to express his love for me in the only way he knew how. We can all understand how complex that is. His parents ended up getting divorced at age 12, and he moved back and forth between the two homes in LA and New York up until dropping out of Santa Monica High School his senior year and returning to New York City to pursue acting full-time. His star began to rise in the 80s. And he began dating Sarah Jessica Parker in 1984. So big name there. That's Carrie Bradshaw from Sex and the City for any men who don't know who she is. And then he had a first few big breaks in the 80s with Weird Science and the Pickup Artist. He began running around with the Brat Pack. So if you're too young to know what that is a group of young actors in the 80s who ended up all becoming pretty famous. That includes Rob Lowe, Emilio Estevez, Anthony Michael Hall, Molly Ringwald, Judd Nelson, all became pretty well known for not only being famous and great actors, but also having significant substance use and partying problems. His fame continued to rise. He played the lead in Less Than Zero, where he thinks he kind of picked up this persona as a drug-addled playboy that he became known as in the 90s, because that's the character he was playing there. His first Academy Award nomination came in 1992 when he played Charlie Chaplin, became really known as a role actor at that point. He had lost to Al Pacino in Scent of a Woman that year. Not a bad loss. The rest of the 90s was really, distinguished by him, flaming out and self-sabotaging in big roles that he could have had, many substance abuse arrests, treatment stints, prison sentences for failing to comply with court-ordered treatment. In the late 90s, Robert was quoted as saying, "It's like I have a shotgun in my mouth and I've got my finger on the trigger and I like the taste of the gunmetal." think about that one again if you ever wonder what it's like to be in the mind of somebody who's struggling with substance use and addiction. Her career was rebirthed to an extent on Ally McBeal, a huge show about a female lawyer in the early 2000s. But he continued to struggle with substance use at that point. He was fired from that role, and he spent a year in court under treatment, which included homelessness. He was considered unemployable. Places could not insure him and get him acting roles because he was unpredictable and dangerous, and they didn't want to have that liability. He went into treatment in 2003 for a long stint. He really credits that long stint in being in treatment for over a year in inpatient residential treatment as the key to his rise in stability and reliability. Of note, just as we're thinking about misdiagnoses in mental health, Robert Downey Jr. was pretty famously at that time diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Robert has admitted to some irritability at points and some impulsive behavior, but also it said, how can you diagnose with somebody with bipolar disorder when you, Robert was famously said in an Oprah interview about that diagnosis, said that, hey, you can't diagnose someone with bipolar disorder when they're smoking crack in your bathroom, which if you've never seen somebody who's manic, it's a lot like they just smoked some crack in your bathroom. What do we all know RDJ for? In 2008, he became obviously world famous and infamous for getting the Iron Man movies under his name. And outside of Iron Man, also in 2008, played a star role in one of my favorite movies where he played Kirk Lazarus in Tropic Thunder.
You can focus up now, motherfucker, and say it. It's me, Tug!
It's me, Tug.
That's right. Now, Tug who?
Tug who? I don't know. Who are you?
Me? I know who I am. I'm a dude playing a dude disguised as another dude.
What?
You dudes don't know what dude he is.
Or are you a dude who has no idea what dude he is and claims to know what dude he is?
What the fuck are you guys talking about?
Like playing other dudes.
I know what dude I am.
You're scared.
I ain't scared. Scared of what?
Scared of who?
Scared of who? Come on, guys, we really need to go.
Scared of you.
Chose that clip in particular because what might the mind of somebody who struggles with substance use and identity be, right? Like, what am I scared of? Who am I scared of? Am I scared of myself? And so really just a thoughtful clip there, and obviously one of my favorite parts of the movie. So he continued to rise in fame and wealth. He became Sherlock Holmes, more Iron Man, who was in Oppenheimer, and is now tabbed to be Dr. Doom in the upcoming Marvel films. So as a guy who struggled with bankruptcy to being named the highest paid actor in Hollywood from 2013 to 2015, he became pretty darn lovable and is really known as one of those good guys in Hollywood who will have your back even through thick and thin, known as a very good friend. Let's listen to Jamie Foxx talk about what a good guy Robert Downey Jr. is.
What kind of blowback did he get from playing the black dude?
None. Because we fucked with him.
Before The Wire, too, though. It was like, what year was Tropic Thunder? I feel like that was like 10 years ago.
It was a while. But here's the thing. We fuck with Robert Downey Jr. Like, that's our guy.
Right.
Like, I did his birthday party. And my first joke was, how dare you take all of these roles from black people?
And really they're just exemplifying, like Jamie Foxx saying, yeah, it was cool he played a black guy in Tropic Thunder because we fuck with him. Right. And so just knowing that you gotta have a pretty good vibe for somebody, for a whole culture like that to really identify and be okay with you playing those kinds of roles in tongue-in-cheek ways. So, Downey really with struggling through his addiction, his first marriage really struggled, including his first string at fatherhood. Downey now married his now wife, Susan Levin, now Downey, in 2005. Adorably, she turned him down a few times saying, I don't date actors. She was one of the producers in one of his films. And they now have 2 kids together. He's been politically active in support for Obama, Clinton, Biden, Harris over the years, although noting that his focus mainly when it comes to politics is anti-recidivism. And if you don't know that term, that's an idea of reforming criminal justice for the best. Having spent so much time in prison himself, he started the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, which is a focus on the federal government for updating and reforming criminal justice programs. He's a big environmentalist. He was a vegan for a while and ended up having to become pescatarian for health issues, but the focus for him is all around his carbon footprint. He's got a new book that came out in January that's super cool called Cool Food, Erasing Your Carbon Footprint One Bite at a Time. So an interesting life for a guy, if you can imagine a youngster in films doing blow with his dad at age 8, all the way to now being an outspoken global warming advocate and one of the richest people on earth. So super interesting that I thought we could focus on today in the addiction block, noting that if you have a problem, it does not mean you cannot be a success. And Robert, thank you. Thank you for all the hard work you did to come out the other side, clean, healthy, and a good force in this world. All right, we'll be right back to wrap up. All right. Let's wrap up by setting our sources and listing our 3 takeaways. While we talked sports and drug testing policy change, we used an SI.com article. I know that Richie had cited blackcannabismagazine.com, and we used that video clip from E! News. Why? Because we are men who contain multitudes on this podcast. Mike and I were really just shooting from the hip when it came to that contemplation talk. We didn't use any sources, especially for Mike, who's really just in that business. When I was talking about Robert Downey Jr., I often use Wikipedia, try to confirm those sources, and ended up using a clip from the Joe Rogan podcast with Jamie Foxx, and then a clip from Tropic Thunder on YouTube as well to help reaffirm those points. So what were our 3 takeaways today? 1, from the intro with Mike and Richie, that policy changes like this are often behind cultural acceptance. So, marijuana had been pretty accepted as culturally significant even before it was legalized in states, and certainly before these drug testing policies were changed in the NFL and NBA. But policy change like that, it ain't quick. When you're coming to government stuff, rules, big bodies like the NFL, none of that stuff will change as fast as the public perception. 2, we can use motivational interviewing as a style to help our friends and family and loved ones get unstuck with change. The pre-contemplation stage, it implies we're stuck. We're not ready to make those changes. So as we get towards contemplation, we can use those styles to help people realize and feel confident. We want the person to think they have the answers, right? Number 3, with Robert Downey Jr., I did not know the depths of his issues and what it was like for him as a kid until I started researching this story. I mean, what can you understand about somebody who was smoking weed with their dad at 6 and doing coke with their dad at 8? There's no way for most people to understand what that's like. Some people in this audience may very well. I could not. So what I wanted to say for number 3 is you really do not understand what someone's life was like until you've asked them, researched it, and remember, let's not be quick to judge, all right? Speaking of not being quick to judge, what's our goal every week? We're going to get out in this world and we're going to be kinder and gentler, be good influences. All right, see y'all next week.